Muy buenos días y bienvenidos a todos. El día de hoy
Good morning and welcome to everybody. Today we will present our guide of infrastructure project management guide, in fact, for safe schools with our allies, the UNDRR. And this guide is another contribution to make of infrastructure a more relevant element within the educational process. The school infrastructure has to go beyond being a space where you just have equipment and furniture. It should also help in the pedagogical models, promoting inclusion, equality, but mainly safe spaces. And this is what we're going to talk to you about today. Up next, the welcome remarks of institutions that have boosted this initiative. On behalf of CAF, I will now give the floor to our Director for the Directorate of Sustainability, Inclusion and Climate Change, Edgar Salas. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Dinora. Good morning to all of you connected to the event. I want to welcome you all on behalf of CAF. I will start by talking about the situation of the planet without specifically talking about the pandemic, but of course in what refers to climate change as a mid and long-term restriction for the activities and survival of humanity. Based on the fourth report of the assessment of IPCC, the consequences of global warming, specifically in Latin America and the Caribbean, will probably be significant. At large scales, we expect that the extremes of droughts, floods, as well as climate and heat will be frequent. The semi-arid locations will be replaced by arid lands. Rainforest on the eastern part of the Amazonia will be replaced by a savanna, and many situations will be like this. The most affected ones, as always, due to these changes, are the third of the population of Latin America and the Caribbean, even under the poverty line. So with this reality, I would like to quote that according to data by UNICEF, based on the establishment of the childhood climate risk change, which is the first thorough analysis from the children's perspective, around 1 billion children, almost half the total amount of 2.2 billion in the world, live in one of the 33 very high-risk countries due to their exposure to the effects of climate change, a phenomenon that jeopardizes their life, their health, and their education, and exposes them to mortal diseases. This index allows to classify countries in view of their exposure to climate and environmental perturbations, as well as their vulnerability to these according to their access to essential services. So this index reveals that in Latin America and the Caribbean, 55 million children are exposed to water scarcity, 60 million exposed to cyclones, 85 to Zika and other part to dengue, and many children are exposed to heat waves, and 105 to atmospheric pollution. In Latin America, 47 million children, 1 out of 4, live in areas affected to at least one of the 4 perturbations that I mentioned, given this context of climate threats, to which we should add geological, biological ones, as well as some others from different natures that may also affect the normal course of educational activities, as well as the well-being of those who make life in school facilities. The duty of ensuring schooling in a resilient manner becomes essential, fundamental to guarantee the right to education. So in order to have this safety and resilient culture at all levels of society, specifically within the educational system, CAF, Development Bank of Latin America, jointly with the United Nations Disaster Risk Reduction Office, UNDRR, has developed the Safe Schools Guide. that bases on the comprehensive school safety framework designed by the Global Alliance for the Reduction of Risk, Disaster, and Resilience in the Educational Sector, made of the UNDRR office jointly with some other United Nations offices and some other NGOs also committed to this. It is based on the construction of a safe school, which is something that combines disaster prevention plans determined by the educational policies, also with a safety framework, safe installations, management of disasters, education for risk reduction and resilience. This guide emphasizes on safe school facilities, offering those in charge in different countries technical supplies that should be considered in order to guarantee the security of infrastructure of these facilities, both for new constructions as well as for existing ones. This structure guideline, based on the comprehensive school safe framework, is divided into 4 sections. The document is an introductory chapter of definition of important concepts as disaster risk, threats, vulnerability, exposure, resilience, the risk management, dedicates the first sections to development agendas and the comprehensive safety framework. The second section has to do with safe school facilities, both for new facilities as well as for the already existing ones. In section 3, it describes the tools to assess safety within the school infrastructure, presenting 2 of the main assessment methodologies for safety within the educational infrastructure launched by the UNDRR, the Index of UNICEF, and the ABIS methodology adopted by UNESCO and developed by the Sprint Lab at the university. In section 4, the guide presents the study case of implementation of the BISUS methodology in Peru, describing the steps conducted for the execution, and it finishes with a reflection chapter and also bibliography. To conclude with this brief introduction, I would like to express my greatest satisfaction for the excellent relationship between UNDRR and CAF that, based on an MOU in January 2021, they've been able to conduct this guide, but it also started with some other initiatives as the project analysis and joint implementation to reduce risk, disaster, and increase of climate resilience in Latin America. So I will conclude here, and I wish that the guide and the session be very much useful to all of you. Thank you very much. Great. Thank you, Edgar. Up next, we will listen to Carlos Zurdiva, Program Management Officer at the United Nations Disaster Risk Reduction. Thank you very much, and good morning to all of you. Thank you, Edgar, also for your introduction, which was quite thorough about the interaction between the UNDRR and CAF. We are very happy to be in this launch. It's the result of great work that we've been doing, as was said, since the signing of the cooperation agreement between the 2 agencies. And I somehow wanted to remind the audience that these initiatives are born in quite a complex situation, given the level of direct loss generated by disaster, economic loss, and sectorial impact. Today, we are working around education, but if we see a broader framework, we know that our region, the Americas and the Caribbean, represent 48% of total loss that are directly linked to disaster. And as Edgar also mentioned, these events generally impact countries with a lower development level, and surely very low income and production levels. So these losses will directly affect development. What we would like to do within the initiatives that we are conducting at the office is to guarantee some consistencies between global frameworks, the Paris Agreement for the adaptation to climate change, and with the Sendai framework to reduce this risk, disaster risk, and all of this under the umbrella of the Sustainable Development Goals, where we see the Sendai framework as a connective tissue that will allow us to inject the reduction for this reduction adaptation to climate change directly to the development DNA. That's the main objective. Many of the things that have been developed also within this cooperation with CAF and in developing these guides is the idea to introduce the systemic nature of risks, and also considering the chain effects and the joint effects that this might have. To do this, we need a deep analysis. With the idea of generating a broader understanding about risk, which is priority one of Sendai framework, we would like to generate some examples in order to guarantee that all players understand better. I would also like to call on the better example that we have today to understand the systemic nature of risk and what's been going on for 2 years with the COVID-19 pandemic. You can see how a threat or biological event affected first the health sector, then the economic sectors, until it generated what we know within risk analysis environment as systemic failure that collapses all of the systems. To counteract all of this, we want to implement something that we call the global framework for risk assessment. And within that, the sectorial integration, data integration analysis is significant, specifically in the education and environment. So we take the comprehensive school safety framework in order to help us establish the data ecosystem, allowing us to generate this type of actions as those represented in the guide, where we want to focus that there are some safe educational facilities. It's very important also to highlight the importance that these safe educational facilities have in the region, where we have this systemic risk context. In some countries, schools are considered also as provisional refuge in case of preventive evacuation. So we do not only need to guarantee safe educational centers in terms of infrastructure in order to host these parts of the population that have been evacuated, but also in order to guarantee an ongoing service. The faster the evacuations with no direct impact to these educational centers, the sooner we can resume activities. So we want to have a direct contribution with elaborating these guides. Within the working framework design, specifically in this cooperation agreement with CAF, we are really very happy today to launch these guides, especially to be able to see that there are already some actions underway, as Edgar was saying, and as it's included in the guide, the experience through the implementations of a VISIRS methodology in Peru. So we already have cases that inspire us. We want to give a step forward and widespread all of these actions. My congratulations to the working team, and a special thanks to CAF, and also a very big motivation for us to launch these guides of infrastructure and project management for safe schools, and also motivate us once again. As I was saying, we have quite a broad and thorough working plan, and we're working within infrastructure, governance, and also safe schools. Once again, thank you very much to the whole team, and welcome to this launch session for the Infrastructure Project Management Guide. Thank you very much, Carlos. So, with those welcoming remarks that present such relevant topics and hard words as fear, loss, threats, cost, we'll see how complex this situation is. What is it that we can do if everything is already lost? Or at the opposite side, we have some breakthroughs in the world and the region at a level of conceptual frameworks in terms of methodologies and tools that will allow us to get ready in order to guarantee safety with a comprehensive view, but also emphasizing, in our specific case, on the educational framework. Up next, Jair Torres will share with us key elements to understand the comprehensive school safety framework, which has given us the context for our guide. Before we give the floor to Jair, let me share with you that he has a PhD in emergency and risk management. He also has a master's in sustainable development at the Sorbonne University, over 15 years of experience in disaster risk reduction, resilience, and adaptation and sustainability. He's one of the experts behind the conception of this framework, as well as the World Initiative for Safe Schools and regional initiatives on this same regard. Likewise, he's been author of the VISUS methodology to assess educational infrastructure. As you can see, he seems to know a little bit about the topic. So, Jair, you have 20 minutes to give us some context of what this comprehensive school safety framework means. Thank you very much, Lenora. Thank you for the invitation. It has been a pleasure to be part of this initiative and of everything we've been working together between CAF and UNDRR. So it's really a pleasure for me. And to add on what you were saying, there are many things to be done. Not everything is lost. If we still work together as a team, as we've proven to have been doing within this interinstitutional work, there are many things that can be implemented to make sure that we'll build more resilient cities, that we will have children that will be in safer facilities, that will understand the processes as the management of risk. And there's a lot to be done, and part of what we're doing today is just a contribution in order to create those more resilient societies. So let me start by talking a little bit about how we got to this comprehensive school safety framework. I hope we'll see whether you can see that on the screen. Great. So this guide aims, well, this guide is the infrastructure project management guide for safe schools. Within this comprehensive school safety framework is aimed at all players in the public sector that are executors and program and managers of educational infrastructure programs, whether it's in ministries of education, ministries of planning, or in each of them. Equally, for those who are also related to the risk management entities at each of the countries in order to strengthen school safety from prevention and disaster risk management. And also, as Dr. Salas also mentioned, mainly focuses on Pillar 1 of the comprehensive school safety framework that talks about safe educational facilities. What are the objectives that we want to obtain? First, to strengthen the understanding of the comprehensive school safety framework, that is to say, what does school safety mean? Second, integrate the disaster risk reduction within planning and execution activities for educational infrastructure, both new infrastructures as well as the already existing ones. And Professor Edgar Peña will be talking about that after my presentation. Third, technically guide those who are in charge of maintenance, assessment, and design of school infrastructure. That is to say, to have some kind of guideline or roadmap that will allow those working in terms of infrastructure to know what are the different paths to follow depending on the challenge ahead. Fourth objective is to introduce considerations for the implementation of assessment methodologies for school standards. We've identified 3 methodologies that have been used both within the Latin American context as well as the Caribbean. And Edgar will also mention this. We have the Safe School model from Zurdiva. We have the UNICEF School Index and the VISAS methodology developed jointly by the Zurdiva University with UNESCO. And fifth, we will introduce the VISAS methodology that we want to express how we can help with this methodology to have a better idea of what is the vulnerability and exposure of educational infrastructure in our context, and we'll talk specifically about the Peruvian case. This is a presentation of the guide to introduce you how we got to that step and what we need to do in order to launch this sort of projects, and in terms of already existing infrastructure, how can we assess it in order to understand the investment requirements that we need to ensure a very good school safety at schools. So, as already mentioned by Dr. Salas, so this guide is divided into 4 parts. First, a link with the development agendas and the comprehensive school safety framework. Second, we're going to talk about safe school facilities, the criteria and technical processes to guarantee the minimum conditions of security and safety. Third, it will speak about assessment tools, as for example, UNICEF School Safety Index and the VISAS methodology. And then it finishes in fourth with an experience of implementation of the methodology, which is the Peruvian case. So how did we get there? It's very important to see that school safety is not just something that happened overnight, but it's part of an evolution of society and how we've been facing the problem of disaster risk management, but also school safety, and how we went from the 50s and 60s from having an idea that risk management was the emergency management or disaster management to get to the Sendai framework, where we see that the most important thing is the creation of individuals, communities, and resilient institutions that are especially prepared in order to reduce and mitigate the disaster risk, and that some way or another are also prepared to respond in case of an emergency. So all of that is part of a construction that has gone through different fluctuations that we had as a society in the world. A first one since the glorious time of technology, where we had many things that we even believed we could control and dominate the world and nature, and we thought that we were going to be able to understand earthquakes and those sort of things, to a different understanding that especially at the beginning of the 90s with the conference of the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development. We start understanding that not only do we inhabit this planet, but we also need to care for it, and that climate change is apparent and might generate many problems, not only in the educational sector, but also in societies as such. So during the whole evolution, school safety has also been making progress, understanding that risk management needs to have more educated citizens that also understand what are the key elements of education for sustainable development, of education for risk reduction, education for climate action has also been part of this evolution that starts in the 90s and forward, which has different milestones, as for example the Yokohama strategy in 2005, the Hyogo action framework, which is also part of the World Conference of UNESCO of Sustainable Education, but also how all of these global and regional platforms launched the idea that it was necessary for us to work jointly in order to try to protect children's lives. In 2008, we had the Sichuan earthquake, where many children were affected in China, and we had several other events, both hydrometeorological origin and geological origin, that impacted on education and children at school. That's how in 2009, within the Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction, in 2007, he corrects himself. In the first session of that platform, there is a request on the part of member states globally to all United Nations agencies, all NGOs, all development banks, so that they can introduce methodologies that will allow us to understand the impact on school safety. And from 2007 onwards, we began a process to understand school safety, because if we talked with colleagues that work all over the world within the pedagogical work, school safety has to do with curriculum development and different processes. If we talk with colleagues that came from infrastructure situation, here it was more related with good construction. If we talked with someone that was coming from risk management, they were talking about contingency plans, etc. So if we talk with our colleagues from FAO or UNICEF or from other institutions, they were saying that it had to do with nutrition. So we became to learn that this concept of safe school safety was quite broad, and we needed to narrow it down in order to better understand it, plan policies, and also actions that will make us be sure of school safety. So in 2009, the Global Alliance for Disaster Risk Reduction and Resilience in the Educational Sector launches what we know today as the Comprehensive School Safety Framework. That framework has been renewed in 2015. We had the Sustainable Development Goals. We adopted them. Then we had the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, and also the Paris Agreements, that are the other three large agreements that have measured the development agenda and also measure the consistency of how we will develop them in a sustainable way, making sure that we are not creating new risks and that we put a risk management within the core of development, and also that we adapt to climate change, that we have a climate action, and only when we have combination between the three elements will we be able to get to more resilient societies. In 2017, based on these three frameworks, we were able to get a first revision of the Comprehensive School Safety Framework, and the last revision was done this year. We are still doing it in order to integrate all of this consistency approaches that I mentioned, also to understand that threats are not only naturally originated, but they are socio-natural, and some social threats that can somehow jeopardize education and also children education, and also jeopardize children per se. And the whole process, we had different declarations, as for example, the World UNESCO Conference on the Roadmap for Sustainable Development Education, etc. So this has been quite a long process that we've arrived after long discussions. What is this Comprehensive School Safety Framework? The CSSF is the way we define school safety in order to protect both students as well as professors and the academia and the whole educational community around schools, in order to plan in a better way the investment that we will somehow conduct within the educational sector, but also to plan how we're going to ensure a continuity of education, how we're going to ensure the development of education per se, and how we need to adapt ourselves for cases of emergency, no emergency cases, etc. And third, in order to safeguard the investment that we conduct in terms of educational infrastructure, we know today that budgets are quite limited, and the investment that we do in the educational sector, we have to make sure to make them the best possible way so that they last in time. And also fourth, in order to somehow strengthen societies that are more resilient, and that also includes individuals and children that are more resilient. This CSSF, as was mentioned by Dr. Salas at the very beginning, is a combination of three big pillars. One, which is in charge of safe learning facilities. We're talking about the educational infrastructure as such, but not just of the walls and the rest of it, but the whole environment surrounding school. What are the risks? What are the threats that might be surrounding that school? to which the school might be exposed. We're talking about the science behind school safety. The second pillar is the management of continuity of learning and school safety. This is how within school and within national institutions, local institutions, we are able to have a continuity of learning, since we have good evacuation protocols, and we have continuous drills, we have continuity plans in order to know when to go back to school, that we have first aid kits, we have committees, that we are really prepared in case of an emergency to be able to take on it, and after the emergency is over, to go back to our education the way we want it to. And the third is a pillar that is more related to the pedagogical sector, that we have education for sustainability, adaptation, and risk reduction and resilience. That is to say that through curricula and extracurricular programs, we're able to understand how threats can become a risk and how we can ensure sustainability. What are the effects of humans on climates, how we could have a climate action, and how we can somehow understand all of those systems that are also part of our societies. All of that is supported by policies and systems that enable to do that, and also by coordination, that is to say, all plans and policies that allow us to ensure that these three pillars work. I'll go back to this later on. So this comprehensive school safety framework should also be integrated to the national educational policy and the national disaster risk reduction policy, but not only to those two. So, what have we achieved based on this comprehensive school safety framework? Today, we already have a political commitment globally, which is the World Initiative for Safe Schools, that has technical support of the Global Alliance that created this CSSF, and is also supported on different sub-regional mechanisms, as the regional group of Latin America and the Caribbean, that together with Zurdiva launched this initiative of safe schools in the Caribbean, as well as the initiative or the Asia Pacific Coalition that support safe schools in Asia. And I can confirm to you that a few weeks ago we launched the Canin Centroamericana initiatives, that is part of one of the processes for the Central American model of integration that is done through SICA. So you can see how, based on the technical area, we are going down to the political area to give our full support from the ministries and governments in order to understand that this is, which has been called a priority in order to achieve the 2030 agenda, can also be implemented. Now let's get into what we are really talking about. We mentioned a while ago about Pillar 3 of understanding how somehow disasters are social constructions. They are not just remote facts, but that somehow disasters are social and not natural construction. And this is a mistake when they talk about natural disaster. We need to raise that from our subconscious, because disasters are social constructions. And within this Sendai priorities, the first priority talks about the need to have an understanding on the risk, and how can we move from this understanding to this comprehensive school safety framework. Well, through curriculum and extracurricular activities, understanding how our natural systems that normally could generate some kind of threat, as we can see here in the chart in this plot. Well, that natural system, when we as a society interact with them and we start manipulating somehow all of these natural systems, we are generating new risks as a society. These new risks are determined in the risk equation per se, that there is a latent threat to which we give a greater exposure, we give greater degrees of vulnerability, and therefore we generate disasters. And this is important to understand ever since we're very little, ever since we're at school. This is something we need to understand, because it will also help us see how we can have more resilient societies. And this happens in a context where, for instance, we've already been able to classify the types of threats we are exposed to. Last year, in very rigorous work with many global scientists, with the International Consortium of Scientists, we generated a publication which is called Classification and Taxonomy of Threats at World Level. And we've classified them in big clusters of 8 threats that are related to social systems, such as conflicts and economic crisis, technological issues, nuclear issues, but there are also threats that are linked to natural systems, as for example, the earth systems and geological threats like tremors, and for example, the natural salinization of earth, biological, as for example, any virus we can be exposed to, meteorological and hydrological, as hurricanes, which are quite present within the Caribbean region, extraterrestrial. We are not really exempt to that. They've occurred, for example, an asteroid that might collapse with Earth, and chemical ones, as for instance, contamination, a natural arsenic contamination that exists in underground water. So we've seen how all of these social systems and natural systems somehow or the other are interrelating, and they are generating something that we call the denaturalization of threats. We see how events that were previously thought to be natural as geological ones, through this we are generating new things in different sites. Through the influence of man, we conduct oil leaks, for instance. Climate change is one of them. So one first element to see that is that interaction between the various systems, the social and natural ones, that create natural and natural social threats that are starting to give us a context of a systemic risk, that these threats somehow or the other are interrelated one with the other. Second thing that we should understand here in this CSSF is that risk is managed by various systems. The educational sector cannot stop generating interaction with other sectors. For example, the health sector, we've seen this with COVID, as well as the telecommunication and information sectors. Same thing, when we closed schools, if we had no access to internet, we would have been unable to take education to where we wanted to. In terms of infrastructure, this is what we're talking today. The power sector, the same way. Agriculture, to make sure that there are good economic resources, but also that we have food safety. That is also part of the safety we want to provide to our children. Also, social systems and social protection system. If we have very good social protection networks, somehow this will also reduce vulnerability of children and of parents, and in general of the educational sector. And all of these systems are managed by various sectors that are interconnected and are part of national risk management systems, also regional ones, and global risk management systems that feedback and share information. So we see here the complexity of what having a guarantee for school safety. A third element that I would like to mention here is everything that has to do with consistency with the 2030 agenda. Carlos also mentioned this. We have 3 very important agendas: the Paris Agreements, the Sustainable Development Goals, the Sendai Framework, and the 3 cannot be disassociated. We cannot have a development policy that generates more CO2 emissions or that would generate new risk. We cannot have disaster risk reduction policy that will somehow prevent mitigation to climate change or that would reduce the development goals. The idea is to be able to focus resilience at the core, reducing vulnerability and improving resilience of these elements. That's why the CSSF needs to have all of these elements integrated within its own conception in enabling systems and policies, each of these 3 pillars, as we said. But also, education ministries should also be able to improve their dialogue, both internally with the various sections within the ministries of education, to make sure that policies are implemented safely, but also to be able to have an influence on plans and national strategies, from other sectors, as for example the National Adaptation Plan or the National Development Plan or the National Social Protection and Child Defense Plan as a national plan for telecommunications, water, and sanitation, because only when the educational sector within a context of systemic risk leaves that silos which has been created with only the Department of Education works with the Ministry of Education and works systemically, only then can we face the systemic risk where we can make sure that we have consistency among the different 2030 agendas, and we are able also to get a level between social systems and natural systems. So this implies that each and every one of the sectors, not just educational sector, needs to have allocated budgets, clear mandates, capacity for implementation, and also monitoring and learning mechanisms that will allow them to improve at a sectorial level, but also entangle with some other sectors. I'm going to give you an example of why later on, and this needs to happen based on children's safety, focus on the individual through school, then at a local level, subnational, national, and global levels. So to conclude, let me just mention two examples of what happened with COVID. The context of COVID revealed, as Carlos said at the very beginning, the complex and interconnected nature of risk that somehow disrupted the normal operation of society. Carlos also mentioned this. We had a biological event that is not just produced by the biological nature of the virus, but also due to the degradation and the barriers that we removed to biodiversity and allow several species to combine in a way which had not been possible before. But this has to do with a different debate. So the economies of the Caribbean countries is estimated to fall 6.2 according to CIPAL. COVID has exacerbated vulnerabilities and inequalities and also gender violence in Latin America. On average in Latin America, primary and secondary school children lost 158 days out of the 190 days of the school calendar for 2020. This means that many of them were unable to go back to the educational system. This is also part of the CSSF and is also part of the educational infrastructure. So that's why COVID is an important case to understand all of this. So how can we do systemic risk in this context? We had a context where there were deficiencies in school infrastructure, especially in terms of water and sanitation, in terms of capacity of infrastructure to support certain type of threats. And this combined with a context of slow economic growth, breakthroughs in the educational coverage, but with some problems of equality and gender equality, we had to get to the stress factor, which is the COVID-19 pandemic. And this pandemic, when seen, the context somehow led us to take public policies as, for example, closing schools. So this was combined with a crisis in the health sector with a reduction of remittances, which means less resources for social investment. Again, crisis from the touristic sector, for example, in the Caribbean, that generates less income in order to invest in social policies or infrastructures for schools. And this finally leads us to having a systemic failure. What does this mean? That the educational system during 2020, we could say that it failed. And why does it fail? Well, it fails because it had an incapacity to guarantee an inclusive and equal schooling and provide permanent teaching to all, as the Sustainable Development Number 4 says. It also fails because there were many unfit infrastructure of educational facilities, not just the infrastructure per se that did not have water or sanitation. Therefore, it would not allow to have this hand washing protocols that we preach so much today, but also the infrastructure failed within the context of virtual education and remote education. So many children were unable to join their classes because the educational infrastructure does not only depend on what happens at school per se, but everything that is being generated included remote and virtual infrastructure. Also, there was a prolonged interruption of educational services. So these last two indicators are part of the indicators of the Sendai framework for risk reduction. That failure in the educational system, some way or another, generated the cascade effect on other sectors, as for instance, failure in or social crisis and children protection crisis. So a lot of violence. We see how failure in the educational sector generated problems in another sector as the of social protection, or other problems in the health sector, for instance, because many children in some contexts and in some countries got their diets or their meals through school. So we see why it's important to have a system or a systemic approach in order to systemically face the various elements we are exposed to today. And with that, I want to conclude before Edgar gets more into detail to speak about this guide and the various processes that we want to guide decision makers so that they can head towards the steps to follow to make sure that we have a very good educational infrastructure. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm at your disposal for any questions. Excellent, Jair. It's clear that this is no easy task. We need coordination, articulation, a systemic approach of risk, because risks go from climate aspect to the risk of losing school year. But up next now, we'll give the floor to Edgar Peña. He's a civil engineer at the University of El Salvador. He's also a professor. He has a PhD in seismic engineering at the Yokohama University, member of the International Platform for the Reduction of Seismic Disasters by UNESCO, also technical referent at UNESCO in security projects, and he's dean of the Engineering and Architecture University at El Salvador. Edgar brings us a guide that we call it a school safety guide, but it's more management for safe schools. But he will talk about the main elements provided by the guide. Remember, Edgar, you only have 20 minutes. Thank you very much. Hello to everyone. As you've seen, I'm going to present how this guide is made of. Many things have been said, and I have to talk about what has to do in terms of infrastructure. I will develop this content and I will talk about it specifically. What we've seen about the comprehensive school safety framework, we need to find a way. I mean, the guide is basically focused on safer learning facilities, and that demands a way to create strategies which are, of course, always related, but we need to focus right now on pillar one, on infrastructure for new schools and already existing schools. Basically, these are the two big groups in terms of infrastructure. For new school centers, one of the advantages is that I have a range of territories where I can build something, and therefore I have that possibility in the sense that I can already design whether or not I'm going to choose a center. We generally have legal considerations, access considerations, whether it's going to be close to where the population is, but we should also consider the threat estimate. It's an important role in order to define whether this place is suitable or not to be chosen as such. Once it's chosen, we can continue with the next step, where we already have the design phases, which includes topography and architectonic design, soil studies, and also structural design. We should mention here that, of course, cost of infrastructure that wants to be built, this will require an interaction process in order to check whether it's not convenient to have a cheaper option. It's important that in selecting the site, we have the participation of the greatest amount of players so as to get a design in accordance with what is required to optimize financial resources in the construction and design stage. This is based on regulations that need to be local and, of course, based on international regulations, because many other countries, as we've seen, have certain construction codes that have been developed elsewhere. It should also be considered, and maybe this is not there and is one of the factors that we need to consider when designing, is that non-structural elements of functional aspect may play an important role in terms of security or safety. And generally, deliverables need to be a series of plans, calculation memories, technical specs, and budget, and so the decision maker will be able to define the options. Of course, plans and or blueprints. After that, we need a construction stage where we also need to have supervision of construction. It depends on the volume of construction needed. You can also find an institution or a company that might be able to do this. The advantage of these new school centers is that they are inexistent, and this is one of the important factors, I believe. And then we would have the worst nightmare for decision maker, which is what happens with those already existing school centers. In those cases, safety levels that are offered by school centers, where should I send funds, what type of interventions do I need? These are many of the questions when you already have a long-lasting school infrastructure and still work, but some details have worn out with time and it requires an intervention. In case of interventions, they're not so focused, but you can also have interventions that for instance, if you have highly floodable centers, some others that have to do with some structural criteria. You can see the columns here and small elements that are susceptible to be cracked in case of a seism or an earthquake. So in this case, this difficulty is because funds need to be managed not just for purely maintenance matters, but also in order to correct some details. Let's see this chart. What happens when I have a new school center? In general, I have a condition here on the x-axis. You have the conditions, and as time goes by, on the horizontal axis, of course, all material generates some kind of a degradation curve. When the degradation is remarkable, I can see that on the paintings, for instance, or on the quality of the material, etc. So if time continues to go by, it is sure that the initial condition will degrade until the construction is left in ruins. However, the preventions that are made is that at some point I define, well, at this point in time, I will conduct a maintenance. Or a corrective actions, where I try to see how that school center or group of school centers go back to a condition which won't be 100% as when it was new, but take it to an acceptable condition. This, of course, demands for investment, and time when these are done depends on the available funds and also on the time investment to do that maintenance. Then, of course, a school center, once interventions have been made, will start again to generate some degradation or deterioration, and we need to find maintenance year after year, or depending on the periods and depending on the materials used, we'll see. But when there is an extreme event, I have a new school center that has degraded in time, but when you have a phenomenon, the drop might be quite blunt. So the condition in terms of time, this might be an earthquake in a matter of seconds. The school center might be damaged. It might take days in a case of hurricanes. It might take months in case of droughts. And why not say that was only an example, but it might take years after a pandemic. So, of course, this deteriorates the infrastructure of the center in great scale, and you need investment, ideally. If I cannot treat that on time, then the school center would suffer severe damage. However, in ideal terms, I would like to make the most investment possible in order to recover in a good percentage the school center and then to continue with the curve. However, it's almost impossible to have full funds, besides the fact that you need time to conduct those investments. What generally happens is that I try to see how to inject funds and gradually get to a stable condition. However, in real life, what happens is that due to the fact that this emergency remands funds, as happened with COVID, and Jair also mentioned this, to assist health centers, school centers continue to be degraded. So the funds that I don't have at that time, when I already have them and I am able to inject them, I try to see a way to get that school center to reach a certain condition. If funds are insufficient, of course, the condition will be lower, or maybe even lower than that. So investments are not really effective, and in those cases, we're already talking about not just a risk management process, but rather disaster management. In terms of the thin line that we have between managing a risk and managing a disaster, of course, it's preferable to manage a risk. From the UNDRR point of view, there are three ways to do so. I'm going to focus on the corrective management, where we have the present risk assessment and what are the interventions that should be done in terms of infrastructure. Because the question of the part of the manager will be, how would I distribute resources? An easy way is, okay, how many school centers do we have? If I have $1 million, I have 1,000 school centers, I will give $1,000 to each of them. Of course, this is quite a brief distribution in terms of infrastructure, but we need to check, first of all, where they are located, because those $1,000, when I buy this supply, I need to consider that we need to take into account transportation costs to get the material there. And equally, in some cases, some school centers might say this $1,000 are not enough because my infrastructure demands more investment. In some cases, those $1,000 may be enough to do so. Of course, that will depend on the size and not just that. But what might happen? Someone might say, I'm only going to focus on school centers that might be affected by earthquakes, which is the only thing that has not happened during this point in time. When I start making those questions and elaborating on them, I realize that what I have to do is to conduct assessment in terms of management. What is it that I have at each of the school centers? And the other point is going on the other side, which is to make an intervention for once and for all. Of course, assessments are more economical than interventions as such, and I cannot conduct any interventions if I don't have the assessments. But I cannot spend everything on assessments, because otherwise I will be left with no intervention. So this is the balance where I need to make a planning in order to reduce the disaster and also adaptate to climate change. This is one of the main schematics that we are looking for whenever I have to design through policies and to conduct these intervention strategies. Again, the difference here is that the land is already been selected and there's a school center there, and unfortunately an earthquake might happen, or we might have certain failures, we might have a hurricane or a forest fire or a volcano or hurricanes, etc. So this means that there are still some social aspects that need to be assessed, because certain interventions should be done in infrastructure. So in that case, we of course have to consider the legal and the use consideration. This is important, but also the estimate of threats is higher, because this last point allows me to understand what will affect the school center, and also I need to assess in parallel to this, what is the vulnerability offered by the school center? That is to say, one thing are the effects and what the causes that generate all of this, which might be all the natural effects that you can see there on the chart. Or on the other hand, what is my weakness in terms of infrastructure? And not just, as Jair was talking about, the walls, etc., but I also need to see the exterior part of the school center. Where are the components that might cause a problem, like backyard or gardens, the non-structural elements and functional elements that are also part of the school center, which are also part of an integrated system, where when I have all of this diagnosis, I will continue to conduct studies. And you can see here that I've changed the order. I would do a topography, a soil study, structural design, and I would leave apart the architectonic design that should be coupled to the other interventions that will be conducted. Of course, This might cause three possible actions, which is repair, replace, or reinforce. Reinforce something like a construction is because though it may exist, it could also be used. However, we need to increase their resistance level. A replacement is when I definitely need to change one element for the other because it no longer can be used for what it was meant to. And repair is when it still works and based on the levels of damage suffered, we can still fix each of these. Of course, these actions, repair, replacement, reinforcement, you could already have a full menu. And ministries and institutions in charge of infrastructure can already have some standardized procedures and have costs where you can already find this, because the main task of knowing how a school center is lies on these two, on estimating threats, which is a probabilistic analysis, but it gives you a good idea of what could happen, and also assessment of vulnerabilities, because with that I already know what I have, and many of the guides that have been generated worldwide in various countries have been focused on these 2 points beyond the design specifically, to see how the buildings design are made. These assessment tools, and Jair also mentioned this, at a Latin American level we have 3. In the guide, you will see 2 of them probably today. We have those generated by Zurdiva, we have those from UNICEF, and those from UNESCO. I will give you some reference of what they are talking about. In the case of Safe School Program for the Caribbean, basically we consider a green and safe assessment. It's for charts where you get information. You will collect information on the field, and each of these charts or tables will add up in order to define an index, a value that will allow me to see whether infrastructure conditions are appropriate or not. An important point is that maybe it has one part, which is table 4, green assessment, to see whether the center complies with environmental conditions. So let me give you an example of how you can see this in terms of infrastructure. You can see here, this is in English, but basically I'm going to focus specifically on ceiling. Ceiling, as you can see, you have a scoring range, and foundation and structure might be in a range between 4 and 12, and you need to put approximately what it is. It's not invented, of course, and here I can put this. In the case of ceiling, if the condition is good, then you can assign 5 or 6. This depends on the inspector, of course, and if it's poor, in case there is visible damage, then you need to put 1 or 2. Of course, if it's broken or has several damages, in those cases, the score on the part of the inspector would be 0. The addition of all of these scores are compared with a table where I can set the rating of the building in terms of security. In this case, you can see that it goes from 1 to 5. 1 represents that the building is in excellent conditions, up to 5, which means that it's unsuitable for the intended use. The school safety index from UNICEF presents similar condition. It's basically divided into 6 parts. One that has to do with the general information of the educational center. The other is components of the environment and the risks. And then the other part that has more to do with infrastructure and functional elements. The rating is not so much oriented at scores per se, but it's managed as low, medium, and high. In the case of the first 2 of the environment of educational center and social risk, it talks about levels of susceptibility. Low would be good. So I have low susceptibility level in terms of violence outside the school. In the case of infrastructure, it measures the level of safety. So classification, low, medium, high, says that structural elements as such have good state, In that case, high is good. In the end, this classification is being filled. You can see here that these are tables, and you fill it in according to low, medium, or high. For instance, for this criteria, structural configuration, mainly you need to put an X, whether it's low, medium, or high, and this gives you some points or scores which are compared in order to establish or the measurable parameters. If it's between 0, 33, 34, or 66, and 64 and 100, the level of safety and the measures to be taken. Of course, this can be adapted to any country. You might say, well, I'm not interested, I'm going to leave it between 0 and 20, between 21 and 66, etc. Indexes, of course, can be modified. Currently, UNESCO made a step, and based on NISA, they made a methodology where they specifically focus on infrastructure, and it divides a school center into 5 portions. Location, the structure, which is also divided at a global or the behavior of infrastructure, and at a local structure where an element can be damaged, non-structural elements, and functional. But the assessments are based on a premise. The assessment of safety is a multidimensional problem. That is to say, for each of them, you might see a series of iconographies. The ordinary use is the first one you can see here, where you have a bunch of people in case of fire, in case of floods, possible earthquake, or possible climate events. So in those cases, a methodology establishes for each these divisions, location, infrastructure, and non-structural elements and function, to establish where is the problem, which of these elements might have a problem in the case of ordinary use of fire, water, earthquake, or air. And in the end, it sets multi-hazard correlation to define where in this school center I need to intervene. The methodology, if you ask me about the forms, well, it changes a little bit because we already have a web page, and it's thought to do it online or offline. This is done through tables of preferences, where you already have all of the iconography and the information that is being collected on the field is immediately launched to a geographical information system, so administrators can see what's going on at each of these school centers. After this information, of course, you can check individual reports and collective reports as well to see what's going on at each of these school centers in order to monitor at safety levels. This is more or less how you can see all the images, and you can click on each of these images and associate a picture to each of them, including buttons where you can also add comments or define the activation. In the end, the methodology establishes this rows of warnings where it says at a level of global structure you have a problem with earthquakes. At a local level, of course, it seems that the greater problem will be in ordinary use. You can see that you can have problems in terms of fire. They are not so serious at a construction level. On the other hand, it does not only talk about the problems that you have, but it also allows you to set an estimated cost of how much needs to be intervened in order to improve the conditions of the school center. This generates an index of classification that you can see in the lower right hand side, where you can see a kind of a pie chart that indicates that, well, it makes a comparison between reconstructing that school center again, or conduct the intervention suggested in terms of all the inspections that were made. In that example, it says that there is 72% of what would represent a cost of an infrastructure to rebuild it again, and the decision maker, of course, defines whether it's better to do that sort of intervention or not. Of course, the methodology is available through UNESCO in order to be implemented in the various school centers. So I'll go to my final remarks. And honestly, we have never analyze the fact that different type of threats jeopardize the conditions of school centers in terms of safety. So that's why it's important to be able to forge alliances, and this leads us to being able to work in terms of the policies that are established in terms of comprehensive safety. Of course, that is also thought together with a guide in order to introduce options, and that decisions on how and where to invest money are more efficient. We know that resources are finite, and of course, the streamlining of their use will be a better way in order to somehow keep safety in an optimum manner in educational centers. So I only have to thank CAF and UNDRR for the opportunity you gave me. Thank you to all of you. Thank you for the patience. This is the third guide I've participated. Well, I have not participated in the other two, but it's an honor of having participated in creating this guide. And I would also like to thank Nora and the whole team, Luis Leandro, Sanskia, Carlos, Jair, for all the collaboration in this. Thank you so much for your attention. We want to thank you, Edgar, for it's been a pleasure working with you. As you were saying, this guide adds to a series of guides that we've been boosting in CAF in order to support the fact that infrastructure based on the design and the management of educational infrastructure is increasingly better, understanding, as I was saying at the very beginning, the role of infrastructure in learning, in security, and safety, in the capacity of spaces in order to convey value and equality and inclusion as well, commitment to the environment. So really, it's very interesting, everything that we can do with infrastructure. No doubt this is something complex. The budget is a big question mark to see how we can keep a budget that will allow us to perform all this maintenance that you explained, Edgar. And we should see that on the field. And we can do this with the introduction of a success case in our region as that of Costa Rica. So we will conclude the event, today's event, with this presentation. We think it's a great way to close the event, because this is a way we can experience what Edgar and Jair have explained. We can see this in real life, and we can also see the challenges for a country like Costa Rica to incorporate this school safety perspective within their planning, and also see future challenges that will be faced. With us today is Catalina Hernandez, Director of Directorate of Infrastructure and Educational Equipment at the Ministry of Education in Costa Rica. She has a master in project management. She has worked on these things since 2008. She's been director since 2019, and since then she has boosted a very important reorganization of the infrastructure directorate that aims at improvement in this sort of projects, always looking for a continuous improvement towards quality process. So Catalina, you have the floor. You can tell us what you've done in Costa Rica in order to learn from your wonderful experience. And you have 20 minutes, remember, to do that. Sorry, I think she's muted. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm already unmuted. Thank you, Dinora, for your introduction. It's a pleasure to be with you today, sharing with you our experience that we had at the Directorate of Educational Infrastructure that has worked for the management of school safety to ensure safety, not only new works and those that will be built, but also in maintenance process for the educational infrastructure. First of all, as you well know, and as has already been mentioned, right to education is a fundamental pillar in democracy and the development of countries. And Costa Rica has been an example in terms of equality, sustainability, and coverage in education for children as well as for teenagers and adults. And a fundamental part also to boost the quality of this service is having safe, healthy, and comfortable educational spaces. And I think that another word that we could add here is resilient, which is what this guide boosts at a regional level, in order to find spaces that will call for innovation in learning. Costa Rica has quite an interesting context given the fact that this coverage that has been boosted for many years in terms of education has turned into a great infrastructure. On the left here, you can see the Costa Rica map, and all the points you can see there within the map in national territory respond to the 5,186 educational centers that we currently manage from preschool to first, second, and third cycle. It was reported in 2021, 953,480 students tuition, and this within a framework of a pandemic that has also somehow reduced the tuition. It's important to consider that in this mapping we've not considered universities or para-universities within the national territory. These educational centers are organized in 27 regional directorates throughout the country. The purpose of these directorates is coordination between the ministry and the central offices, as well as the educational centers. This is a very important reference framework because it allows for managing the request of infrastructure with a first filter at a regional level that also allows us to set priorities on how to respond to the educational infrastructure. Within this context that I mentioned previously, also links to several other players that we have in the educational infrastructure nationally, where the Ministry of Public Education, MEP for its acronym, has designed the infrastructure directorate as the instance that plans and manages educational infrastructure projects, but it also has some other players that should also work in order to achieve all of these projects, both for new works as well as for maintenance works. In this case, the educational committees or boards, these are groups of people that are integrated per community center or educational center. So per each center, we have an associated educational board that generates a budget and allows for different projects of various types within the institution. It follows a regulation, and by regulation it's indicated that these boards cannot do any construction or maintenance process if there is no previous authorization of the Educational Infrastructure Directorate. This is a monitoring process, which is very important, that the Directorate and the Ministry per se determine in order to make sure that the quality of the infrastructure that will be built or the maintenance that will be done complies with human safety and accessibility standards that are very important at a national level. Of course, we have those institutions that were built prior to this regulation that even though follow bad construction techniques that have been solved with a proposal which is construction through the institutional proveeduría in order to hire design as well as construction of works. And through this proveeduría or institutional monitoring house, we are trying to see pre-qualified managers that would not only conduct more agile processes to hire people for new works or maintenance services, But also, it will make sure that bidders or contractors that will develop these works are also experts in educational infrastructure. This is a very important step because we'll also be able to call these contractors to trainings that will enable infrastructure to be built in a better way. An important aspect, the fact that there's also a regulatory framework which is quite broad and also involves many external players from the Ministry of Education in aspects regulating human safety, also accessibility, that regulates the environmental aspect, which is also very important in Costa Rica, and also regulates some health aspects. So we already have a regulatory framework that should be complied with, not only for new works, but also for the construction of maintenance works. And there is also a platform that the Collegiate of Engineers and Architects has determined in order to generate or elaborate blueprints and also to generate infrastructure projects, not just for education purposes, but within the whole construction environment. This collegiate is the one that also regulates the profession as an architect or engineer, and therefore it also regulates professionals that are signing to that collegiate. But this platform is really very important because it also manages the authorization that should be requested. Without such authorization, we cannot build. This infrastructure directorate is a key element. We also rule policies and regulations that have to do with the educational sector. But apart from that, within the platform, we have firefighters, which is an instance of the National Insurance Institute and regulates human safety and is associated to the regulation of Law 8228 and the General Regulation on Human Safety and Protection Against Fire. We also have the Ministry of Health that regulates all of health aspects and also human health aspects. There are some other instances that are very important in managing projects, as for example the National Commission of Emergency, especially working with natural disasters, also different municipalities that support construction processes. And right now the Federate Collegiate works on the integrating into this platform the Technical Secretariat of Environment, CETENA for its acronym, that provides the support to infrastructure projects, both at national level, but in this case with specific parameters in terms of education, in this case specifically. So this context is important because it also ensures maturity in our country that has evolved in time, but also the educational infrastructure director has not left behind. And for a long time, they've generated very important supply that after Edgar's exposure, we know it will be very important support to determine some other aspect, not just the assessment of the existing infrastructure, but how can we generate educational spaces that will comply with the human safety, accessibility, and environmental standards regulations. In the case of Costa Rica, the infrastructure institution has been boosting all of these plans, and there are over 60 school space that have already been designed, specified, and also budgeted. And this blueprint generation is updated quite frequently, so they are very much updated as time goes by. They represent educational spaces as, for example, academic classrooms or health batteries or administrative offices at schools, also like covered loans for sports and workshops and other things that are also required. All of these are annexed within the construction regulation of Costa Rica. They already have support on the part of construction, which has been done by the Collegiate of Engineers and Architects, and it complies with all of the standards. And these blueprints are also determined within the contract banners as a basis for the design of educational centers, and it also has a technical specs that are used as basis for contract banners of maintenance services that might be required. They not only have a construction typology, but many other typologies that also allow us to use them in different occasions according to the need. As you can see in the renders down there, we've not only generated various educational spaces, but also these typologies that are aiming at adapting various climate areas. In Costa Rica, we have several microclimates, as well as to determining factors of the geomorphology or topography of our territories. We have two-level buildings that have different modules in terms of stairs, ramps, and elevators that could be tailored to the needs of institutions. We also have covered courts, which are mostly built in metallic elements, and also beams that could be bigger or smaller according to requirement. And you can see on the image on the right, you have a prototype built with some pillars for very remote access or areas that are topographically very difficult or floodable areas. This is the sort of prototype that we use. Then we have some other prototypes that we also use. We have classrooms, masonry. We have some kind of puzzle because one is associated to the other, and this is how we generate the different aisles in the institutions. We also have some pre-manufactured prototypes. This is one of the mostly used typographies because it's quite quick to install, and we've also had a lower cost, which is closer to the cost that we have of some other material typologies, but this is one of the most frequent ones in Costa Rica. We also have three-level buildings that also have their ramps and stairs and elevators modules. And we also have prototypes with monitors in order to ensure cross ventilation for hot or humid areas. What you can see down there on the side with different blueprints, it also generates design typologies, in this case of cafeteria. It's important to mention that both cafeteria typology as well as workshops and health areas are not only established as one single prototype, but we can handle different areas according to the educational capacity required by the institution. So you have cafeteria that are 72 square meters up to 250 square meters if required. So we manage different specifications for aisles and ramps where we determine the type of minimum slope it should have. And also with these construction blueprints, they become, let's say, workshop blueprints. This is very important, since they should be combined to different construction blueprints for the whole institution if that's required. But prototype plans already have specifications not only about a construction material, but also on the tools. For instance, the cafeteria that is required, or maybe sanitary floors. And it also determines lights or ventilators that should also be considered for classrooms. Another important tool for this infrastructure is the tool for inspection and diagnosis of needs. It is used every time we detect a need at an educational center. So a professional goes to the field and generates a report with this tool. It has two modules. In the first one, which is called General Information and Observations on Site. We have an administrative, legal, and technical feasibility of the project, and it's very important here because within this technical feasibility, we also have an assessment of infrastructure by architectonic and structural elements, and what is the impact of this infrastructure on site. It is limited by pavilions. We have general architectonic, structural, mechanical, and electrical criteria defined for each of them. We also set bioclimatic factors. We have an assessment by likelihood and level of risk of the internal external geodynamics, also determine the hydrometeorological and anthropic risk of institution, and certain things to be considered. Each center has some specs that have to do with the community or the society that should also be considered. We generate some croquis of an institution and also photographs. This evaluation is also done as a traffic light, where we determine the most important aspects in terms of risks or lower risk, and based on that we make technical decisions. In the second module, we have determination of budget feasibility, given the fact that here we determine cost requirements, both of works that need to be done, lower maintenance, higher maintenance, new works that need to be generated, complementary works that will be determined at the institutions, and also what are the requirements and costs of professional fees and technical studies that are required, whether it's topography or aerotechnic, or hydrology, etc., that is needed in the institution. And last, we have the signature of professionals that are drafting the report. Almost always this report is done between two professionals, maybe an engineer or an architect, and an electromechanical or electrical engineer. This tool has an advantage or a limitation that has been seen in the directorate, that the reports generated are individual. That is to say, it allows to determine or to make a decision by educational center, but the infrastructure directorate has seen a need to have a tool that will allow us to nationally prioritize the elaboration of project pipelines or portfolios, because as was mentioned before, the budget and the use of resources in the best possible way, in the most efficient way, is a key element in order to work at a national level in everything referred to educational centers and ensure a safe school in terms of infrastructure. So for a couple of years, we've been working with a tool that the Ministry of Public Education has been developing, which is the Saber platform. This is an acronym. It means Basic Administration System of Education and Resources, and this is a digital platform that was developed thanks to the cooperation with the European Union together with the Ministry of Public Education. It is a file per educational center that allows us to consider all institutions at a national level. It's been done by stages because the need we have to generate files both on the part of students and professors is quite broad. It manages sensitive information and therefore it should be safeguarded. But one of the stages that has been considered is that of a file for the educational centers. You can see on the right, we have a generation of that file that is part of step 7. However, the directorate had quite an important space during the first stage in order to generate a very basic evaluations on the installation of educational centers that was done by directors of institutions. So the technical level that we have is not the one that we are expecting in order to work on the second part of the experience, where we need to have a different type of technicians or professionals conducting this assessment in order to have a greater prioritization. However, the first step gives us important analytical information to generate the strategies we will be using to do this in the future. Right now, we've already given all the information as an infrastructure directorate so that the platform begins as from next year with the development of this assessment. We still need to generate proof for users and or test for users and the trainings about the use of the tool. And to conclude, as for the important challenges ahead, of course, they are linked to this work, this joint work that we need to develop for a national infrastructure assessment that could be coordinated with the academia and other regional players, because the infrastructure assessment level we need, it can no longer be provided by an educational center. And if we have 5,180 educational centers, of course we cannot think that the directorate will be assessing all of that. However, as I said before, we do have tools that have already been set into action. We already have infrastructure assessments that are of technical character, and one of the challenges is to systematize them in order to have a big data that will allow us with this diagnosis to make decisions at a national level or more global level, and have annual portfolios. Limitations as any country in the region, and very possibly we have budget limitations that are giant, and next year we will have a smaller budget than the one it had during its whole history since the directorate was formed. And this presents some very important projects that we need some important decisions to be made in order to have a correct use of resources and be used in the best possible way. And all structure, both in terms of maintenance and new works, is done probably well. And limitations in human resources, as you know, the infrastructure limitation, as happens elsewhere, has very few people. So here the executive arms that we need to develop projects, as for example an assessment at a technical level, is really very important to be able to have resources as the academia, for instance, universities might bet on doing joint work with ministries, as we are coordinating right now with a university in Costa Rica, the University of Costa Rica, and some other players that might add to this administration. And with that, I conclude my presentation, and I thank you for the time you've given me. I also leave the page of the Educational Infrastructure Directorate. You can find all of the prototypes and the catalogs offered, and also some maintenance guides that have been provided to the educational boards and the map of the educational center. So thank you very much for your attention, and I will conclude my presentation here. Thank you. Excellent, Catalina. Thank you very much. So, to close this session today, we have some questions from the audience. The first one is, where can we get the guide? We haven't talked about that. This guide, as well as the other two for planning and design for educational infrastructure projects, you can find them in Cioteca in our webpage. For the time being, only in Spanish, but we'll probably have the 3 guides in English and Portuguese as well. So you can at least start seeing the Spanish version. In order to maximize our time, we're a little bit ahead of our time. We're a little bit delayed, sorry, but maybe we can answer some of the questions that we got here. We have a first one, which I think it's for you, Jair, but they're asking about the progress of the regional initiative for school safety for Latin America, because in your presentation it was clearly seen that the Caribbean has made progress, Asia too, but Latin America, it's kind of lonely in that map, right? So in 1 minute only, please tell us how they are doing and how we can support you to make it better. Yes, the Central America Initiative was launched 2 weeks ago within the framework of the integration of SICA. And for South America, we're still waiting to see when it can be launched. First, we need initiative of a country that wants to be a flagship for or to spearhead this South American initiative and can relate it to what happened in Central America and the Caribbean. And the good thing is that in the Caribbean we have a very good example that has been fundamental for the creation of the Central American Initiative for School Safety. We already have some approaches. UNICEF has been working on that, UNDRR also, but we are seeing how we can have a country that wants to be the pioneer, the first hosting country for said initiative, and maybe we could find the necessary resources in order to take that first ministerial meeting where we will have a political commitment that will boost the technical aspect. Great. So, we'll be doing our part also to achieve that. Another question that has to do with the VISUS methodology. So I think this is for you, Edgar. And the $1 million question, is this methodology free? How can we implement it? If there's a country that wants to conduct all of these assessments for threats and vulnerabilities that you talked about. In fact, the methodology is free. It is managed by UNESCO. And there you can also find more information in terms of management or the things that you have to do at a governmental level, but it's free of charge. What you need is that a country should be requesting it. I mean, the platform authorizes confidentiality of information. It's not public information, so there's liability, and there are several players. Also, this includes universities, ministries, in order to develop it. So I think that Jair maybe could speak a little bit more about how to manage it. Yes, I mean, one way or the other, the business methodology can be obtained and it's available at the UNESCO website. There you can download the 3 volumes of the methodology. The important thing is that what we understand as a methodology is not one size fits all. It's not a universal one, but you need to adjust it to the country's realities in terms of construction topologies and various threats. It's not the same thing, the tsunami risk in Peru or in Bolivia where we have no coastline. So the methodology fits the risk methodology, topology of a country, and these adaptation processes, which are in general processes that are done in a collective way, where the specialized center of UNESCO, which is at the UD University, and national entities of ministries of education, and as in Costa Rican case, also engage in the national academia, you can somehow obtain sustainability and understand how to adapt it to real context. So the methodology is online, you can see it, you can access it, but everything that has to do with the adaptation, development of capacities, implementation per se, testings and pilot projects, that is done in coordination with the UNESCO, which is in the Udine University in Italy. Excellent. Thank you very much to both of you. And to close, the last question for Catalina Salas. I'm sorry, I went directly to your second surname when I introduced you. So a simple question to answer. In view of a change of government, that you will have in your country, how do you think that everything that has been done is already there? Are you certain that that will continue? Do you think that there are some steps that could happen in order to reinforce those progress and those efforts that you have been making on school safety? How do you see that transition, especially the guarantee that there will be a continuity of a public policy related to that? Well, the path of this work, the evolution and the maturity in order to reach a first stage in this Sabata platform has been based on efforts that are not only proper of this administration, but also before that. So there's technical work that cannot be lost. The Sabata platform is also a system that remains in time. In fact, the generation of supply that will be starting next year continues in the administration. So in fact, the risk that this process will go down, will collapse, is really minimum and almost null, I would say, because the technical level that we've reached is quite a big road. So we have a lot of confidence. We have lots of supply and infrastructure director. We're still heading that way regardless of a change in government or in administration. Great, wonderful news to close the event. So on behalf of CAF and on behalf of UNDRR, we would like to thank you. First of all, thank the panelists. You had great presentations. You gave us with lots of reflections and lots of homework the challenge of facing in a successful way the multiple threats that are connected, and the example of COVID-19 has been quite evident. It's not minor, and as a country and as a region, we need to be better prepared in being able to face those threats and do it with a comprehensive perspective and with a systemic view to respond to those risks. We hope very honestly that this guide serves as a tool that will in fact allow us to be ready to that response, indicating or giving us some hints of how to optimize resources, how to strengthen the capacities of our ministries of education and the strategic partners on the one hand to assess infrastructure, to plan, to manage risk whenever it appears, but also to educate towards resilience, which is what we have ahead. We hope that this guide also serves as a tool that will facilitate dialogue among various players on our part, as well as on behalf of UNDRR. We have the best and the greatest availability and disposal to generate some dialogue spaces with the guide as main flagship, in order to start a technical dialogue with the rest of the countries and see how to better support them in this endeavor. So we are at your disposal. We hope that what has been said today is really very useful for everyone. And see you next time. Have a nice day. Thank you.